The mornings in her apartment always began with an ordered quietness, as if every object had agreed to stay exactly where she had placed it years earlier. She moved through the rooms with the precision of someone who had learned to inhabit silence without disturbing it. At 51, she carried a discipline that had not come from ambition, but from necessity, the need to survive days that once seemed too long, too heavy, too uncertain. The coffee machine, the polished counter, the neatly aligned shoes by the door. Each small ritual reminded her of the years spent rebuilding what had been slowly dismantled during her marriage. There was a steadiness to her life now, but also a subtle emptiness, something like an echo in a room that used to hold voices. She had become efficient, admired, reliable, yet rarely seen in the way the heart hopes to be seen. At work, she was respected without truly being known. Her competence filled meeting rooms, but her presence seemed to shrink whenever conversations drifted to personal stories, to families, to relationships that people displayed like trophies or wounds. She no longer volunteered details about her past. She had learned that most only listened to classify, not to understand. And she had grown accustomed to the subtle glances that assessed her age before her words, as if 51 contained an unspoken expiration date on softness, romance, or tenderness. She felt it in the polite comments about experience, in the jokes colleagues made about aging, and in the unguarded stares younger men gave her, stares that skimmed over her as if she were a landscape already mapped and familiar. Occasionally, memories from her marriage rose like dust disturbed by footsteps. Not dramatic scenes, not shouts or slamming doors, but small degradations that had collected over time. A dismissive chuckle when she voiced an idea, a comparison disguised as concern, the way he would speak on her behalf at gatherings, shaping her identity in front of others as if she were an accessory to his narrative. She had not noticed the shrinking while it happened. Only after leaving did she realize how much space she had surrendered. Now, even separated, remnants of his influence lingered in the way she second-guessed her worth whenever she entered a room. In the late afternoons, when the office emptied and the city softened into a slower rhythm, she often walked home rather than drive. The movement gave her a sense of direction, even when she didn't feel particularly directed. She watched couples in cafes, groups of friends laughing on benches, younger women rushing past with an urgency that once belonged to her. She no longer envied youth itself, only the ease with which the young believed the future would always cooperate. At 51, she knew better. She had learned that life did not follow the arc promised in movies or books, and that sometimes survival became the victory. Still, there were moments when she longed for something gentler, something that didn't feel like a compensation for all she had endured. Evenings brought a quiet she neither loved nor hated. She cooked for herself, usually too much or too little, and let the television play shows she did not fully watch. There was comfort in the routine, but also a persistent awareness of absence, not of a man, but of being seen, being chosen, being valued without conditions. She had stopped expecting those things long ago. The world, she believed, did not offer such gifts to women her age. And yet, somewhere beneath the layers of resilience, a part of her still wondered whether life might someday surprise her. That small part had not died. It had simply learned to sleep. Her phone buzzed with a message from her ex. Another logistical question about a document, a signature, a detail he could easily have resolved alone. Their exchanges had become transactions dressed as communication. She answered briefly, politely, and set the phone aside. As she sat on the couch, the city lights flickering through the window, she felt the familiar heaviness of being capable in every practical way, but unseen in every emotional one. She didn't know that someone would soon challenge that belief. She didn't yet imagine that a younger presence, steady, observant, quietly warm, would begin to unravel the narrative she had accepted as truth. For now, she simply existed within the boundaries she had built, unaware that they were about to be gently, persistently expanded. He had been there for months before she truly noticed him, blending into the rhythm of the office with the unassuming confidence of someone young enough to be unafraid, yet mature enough to move without arrogance. At 30, He carried an ease she rarely saw in men his age, an ease not of carelessness, but of presence. His steps were deliberate, his tone calm, his eyes attentive in a way that made people slow their pace without realizing why. She had seen him in meetings, speaking concisely, offering ideas without the need to dominate. He seemed to understand space, how to enter it, how to share it, how to respect it. Her awareness of him began with something simple, the way he held the door for her without the exaggerated courtesy that often felt like pity. He did it naturally, as if it were simply part of moving through the world. Then came the small observations. A mug placed near her workstation when she arrived early, a file she needed set aside before she asked, the faint smile he offered when she looked tired after long afternoons of decisions and adjustments. She tried to dismiss these gestures as coincidences, but each one landed with a quiet precision she could not ignore. He seemed to notice the parts of her that most people overlooked, the way her shoulders tensed when someone interrupted her, the way she exhaled slowly after receiving messages from her ex, the way she minimized her accomplishments as if they were fragile. He never addressed these things directly. He simply adjusted his presence around her, making space where others crowded, offering steadiness where others competed for attention. She felt herself relaxing in moments she did not intend to relax. It unsettled her. The age difference hovered over her thoughts like a number written in invisible ink. She calculated it without wanting to. 51 and 30, 21 years. She repeated the equation in her mind as if it were evidence against any possibility of connection. She reminded herself that he likely admired her only professionally, that younger men might appreciate strength in older women, but rarely desired vulnerability from them. She told herself that whatever warmth she sensed was simply her imagination reaching for what life had long denied. And yet, there were moments when his gaze lingered, not with intensity, but with clarity, as if he were seeing something she had forgotten existed. One evening, she stayed later than usual, reviewing documents under the glow of a desk lamp. He passed by, paused, and placed a bottle of water on the corner of her table before continuing without a word. She watched him walk away, noticing the steadiness of his posture, the quiet determination in his pace. Something inside her shifted, something delicate, almost imperceptible. She felt seen, not for what she represented, not for the image she upheld, but for the person who often hid behind competence and routines. In the days that followed, she found herself anticipating his presence in ways she tried to suppress. A glance across the room steadied her when conversations grew tense. His thoughtful questions reminded her that she still possessed ideas worth hearing. He listened, not to respond, not to correct, but to understand. The more she observed him, the more she recognized a depth that defied every assumption she had built about younger men. He was not restless, not impulsive, not seeking validation through conquest or performance. He was simply present, and that presence began to fill a quiet space in her life she had not realized was vacant. Despite the growing connection, she resisted the possibility of anything more. She imagined the judgments, the whispers, the predictable comparisons, old enough to be his mother, they would say. She felt her confidence shrink whenever she considered how the world would frame such a bond. The difference of age became, in her mind, a barrier she had no right to cross. She convinced herself that he would eventually drift toward someone younger, someone who matched the expectations society had prepared for him. And yet, every time he looked at her with that calm, assured gentleness, a part of her wondered if she was wrong. She noticed him most clearly on a morning when she felt particularly fragile, after a night filled with old doubts resurfacing. She entered the office holding herself together with determination, but he sensed the weight she carried before she said a word. He didn't try to fix it. He simply offered a presence that grounded her, as if reminding her she did not have to navigate everything alone. That morning marked the beginning of a quiet shift, not in what he did, but in what she allowed herself to feel. Something inside her opened cautiously, like a door that had been closed for so long it forgot the sound of its own hinges. The past rarely arrived as a single memory. Instead, it came in fragments, drifting into her mind during quiet moments she had not invited. As she moved through her days, Flashes of her former life appeared like faint reflections on glass, never loud, never dramatic, but persistent enough to remind her of everything she had once accepted without question. She had spent years in a marriage built not on cruelty, but on erosion. It was the slow wearing down of her voice, her choices, her presence. The world often imagined heartbreak as a sudden storm, but hers had been more like a gradual dimming, the kind a person notices only after realizing the room has grown dark. She remembered dinners that began with poised conversation and ended with her silence. Her ex-husband had a way of redirecting attention toward himself, subtly overshadowing her without seeming to intend it. Whenever she offered an opinion, he would tilt his head slightly, as though preparing to correct her. When guests praised her achievements, he added context, framing her success as a shared effort or a fortunate coincidence. Nothing he said was harsh, but each phrase reshaped her image until she became a softened outline beside him. She learned to speak less, to smile more, to adjust herself in ways that made her smaller. Over time, she noticed how easily others mirrored him. At gatherings, people asked about his projects, his ideas, his promotions. They spoke to her only about logistics, children, schedules, errands. She became the keeper of practical matters, the one who ensured life ran smoothly while he occupied the stage of admiration. In her quiet moments, she wondered when she had stopped being someone people were curious about. She didn't resent him. She resented the version of herself she had become under his shadow. Even after the separation, he managed to occupy space in her life, not out of malice, but habit. He contacted her about paperwork, about a missed appointment, about a detail he could have handled alone. Their exchanges were polite, almost rehearsed, but they carried the familiar imbalance. He assumed she would take care of things because she always had. She complied, not because she wanted to, but because she feared the consequences of disrupting the roles they had played for so long. There was a part of her that still felt she owed him something, though she could no longer name what it was. The young man at work had unknowingly exposed the lingering effects of that marriage. His attentiveness, so natural and unforced, contrasted sharply with the dismissive tone she had lived with for years. When he listened, she felt the weight of being heard, not as an obligation, but as a choice. It made her realize how deeply she had internalized the belief that her thoughts required justification. She caught herself apologizing unnecessarily, offering explanations before anyone demanded them. Each time he responded with quiet understanding rather than impatience, she glimpsed another piece of the woman she had once been, the one who spoke without shrinking. Yet the memories of her marriage clung to her like dust that refused to be brushed away. She recalled birthdays where her efforts were acknowledged only in passing, anniversaries celebrated with formality rather than affection, arguments disguised as discussions where her feelings were framed as exaggerations. She remembered the way he would place his hand on her back at social events, guiding her gently but firmly, as if positioning her more than accompanying her. She had mistaken this for partnership until she realized she had been led rather than seen. The most painful remnants were not the moments he criticized her, but the ones where she censored herself before he had the chance. She had learned to anticipate his reactions, to soften her tone, to adjust her choices, to shape her preferences around his comfort. Even now, years later, her instincts sometimes betrayed her. When someone disagreed with her, she felt the old tightening in her chest. When she received praise, she struggled to accept it fully. The marriage had left shadows that did not disappear simply because the relationship ended. As she sat at her desk reviewing reports, the weight of those remnants settled over her with surprising clarity. She realized she had been carrying them as if they were part of her identity, but they were not. They were artifacts of a life she had outgrown. The presence of the younger man, steady, grounded, quietly supportive, reminded her of what it felt like to be valued without condition. He was not trying to rescue her, not trying to define her, not trying to reshape her narrative. He simply allowed her to exist without shrinking. That realization brought both comfort and fear. Comfort, because she sensed a new possibility emerging. Fear, because possibilities demanded courage she was not sure she possessed. The remnants of her marriage whispered familiar warnings. Don't draw attention. Don't expect too much. Don't risk embarrassment. Don't imagine a man, especially a younger one, could see your worth without hesitation. But somewhere beneath those whispers, a quieter truth stirred. She had survived the slow erasure of herself once. She had rebuilt. And now, unexpectedly, she was beginning to feel herself expand again. Not because of him, but because his presence reflected back the person she could still become. The past had shaped her, but it did not have to define the rest of her life. She felt that truth rising, fragile yet insistent, like the first breath after years spent underwater. Their connection deepened not through grand gestures, but through the small, consistent threads woven into ordinary days. It began with shared moments after long work hours, walking toward the parking lot while the city hummed in the background, or lingering near the elevator with coffees warming their hands. These moments did not announce themselves as significant, yet they carried a softness that gradually loosened the tension she wore like a second skin. She found herself speaking more freely around him, not because he encouraged it, but because his presence invited it. Cafes became a quiet refuge where the weight of her responsibilities seemed to dissolve. He listened with a stillness that was rare, a stillness that did not rush her or urge her to simplify her thoughts. When she described a difficult meeting or a decision that felt heavier than it should, he offered not solutions but clarity, as if he could see the structure of her feelings even when she struggled to name them. She noticed how attentively he observed the world, the way he watched people enter the cafe, the way he noticed when someone seemed tired or overwhelmed, the way he adjusted his tone to match the emotional space of a conversation. This sensitivity felt like an antidote to years of being spoken over. She didn't understand why he chose to spend so much time with her. She assumed he admired her professionally, her experience, her composure, her decisiveness. But there were moments when his gaze lingered with a quiet warmth that unsettled her in ways she could not articulate. She felt as though he was looking at her without subtracting anything, without reducing her to age, to history, to the mistakes she once carried. He saw her fully, and that was the strangest part. Being seen without being diminished. As the days unfolded, she began to feel a subtle courage rising within her, like a breath she had been holding for years finally releasing. She allowed herself to laugh more openly, to share pieces of her past without flinching, to express frustration without filtering every word. He received it all with a steady gentleness that made her question why she had spent so long believing she needed to hide. When he spoke about his own life, the pressures of being underestimated because of his age, the quiet determination to grow on his own terms, she felt an unexpected alignment between their inner worlds. Their ages differed, their wounds did not. Still, fear threaded through her thoughts, especially when she imagined how others might interpret their closeness. She pictured the raised eyebrows, the condescending smiles, the whispers framed as concern. She imagined the certainty with which people would judge her. Older woman, younger man, an equation society loved to distort. She worried he would one day see her through that same distorted lens. The idea of being someone's embarrassment, someone's hidden secret, sent a coldness through her chest. Yet he never treated her as something to hide. When they walked together through busy halls or crowded lobbies, he did not shift his posture or change his pace. He carried himself with the calm dignity of someone who had nothing to prove. His presence beside her felt intentional, not accidental. And she sensed that he did not measure her by the standards the world imposed on women of her age. He measured her by the quiet strength she carried, the authenticity she rarely displayed, the resilience she had earned through years of surviving what others never saw. One evening, after a long day, they found themselves in their usual cafe. The light was warm, casting a golden hue across the wooden tables. She felt particularly vulnerable that day. Tired, worn, uncertain. He noticed before she spoke. Without asking, he slid his cup slightly closer to hers, as if creating a small space where she could rest. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the room settle around her. When she opened them, she found him watching her, not with pity, but with recognition, as if he understood the weight she carried without needing explanations. In that moment, she felt a quiet shift inside herself. She realized that the courage she was gaining did not come from him, but from the way he mirrored her own strength back to her. He made her remember parts of herself she had once believed were gone. The parts that dreamed, the parts that hoped, the parts that longed to be seen without armor. She didn't fully trust these feelings yet. Fear still lingered like a thread woven through her thoughts. But there was also something new, a gentle pull toward the possibility of a life that held more than survival. She left the cafe with a sense of clarity she had not expected. She understood that whatever was unfolding between them was not defined by age, by expectation, or by fear. It was defined by presence, by the way he offered space for her to exist without shrinking, and the way she allowed herself, cautiously, to step into that space. The courage she felt was fragile, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if her story might still have chapters she had not yet dared to imagine. The message arrived on a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where the hours moved without urgency. She glanced at her phone expecting something routine, perhaps a work reminder or a grocery notification. But the sender's name froze her breath before she even opened it. Her ex-husband. The words were simple, polite, even familiar. Yet the impact was immediate. An invitation to a family gathering, one she had not expected to be included in. A relative's birthday, an evening in a private room at a restaurant. A space she knew would be filled with people who remembered her not as she was now, but as the version of herself that had lived in his shadow. Her first instinct was refusal. She could already hear the comments disguised as jokes, the subtle glances, the questions framed as concern but dripping with judgment. She imagined the old dynamics, him speaking with confident ease, others orbiting his charm, her presence fading into the background. The thought alone tightened her chest. She considered ignoring the invitation altogether, but decades of learned politeness compelled her to respond. She typed a short acceptance, her fingers stiff with reluctance. For the rest of the day, the invitation lingered in her mind like a soundtrack she could not turn off. Each time she tried to focus on work, her thoughts drifted back to the upcoming evening. The table, the voices, the possibility of being scrutinized. And woven through those fears was another thought she tried to suppress. He would be there too, the young man who had quietly become a part of her world. Their connection was still something fragile, undefined, yet undeniably present. She wondered how he would react if he knew. She wondered, more secretly, whether she wanted him beside her. She didn't plan to tell him, but he noticed anyway. He noticed it in the way her shoulders sat slightly higher, in the distracted rhythm of her breathing, in the way she paused before answering simple questions. As they walked out of the office that evening, the city wrapped in fading light, he looked at her with the calm curiosity that always made her feel less alone. She didn't need to explain the invitation. He sensed the emotional weight before she found words. The cafe they often retreated to felt different that night. Not a refuge, but a mirror. She stirred her drink longer than necessary, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. When she finally described the event, she spoke carefully, avoiding the deeper emotions beneath. She described the family setting, the private room, the expectations. What she didn't say, but he understood, was the fear of returning to a place where she had once been diminished. He listened without interruption, letting her voice find its way through the hesitation. She felt exposed, but not judged. There was no trace of amusement, no hint of condescension, only a grounded presence. She had expected him to give advice or encourage confidence, but he did neither. Instead, he asked gentle questions, not about what she feared others would say, but about what she wanted for herself. His questions shifted the focus from the weight of the past to the possibility of reclaiming her own space. In the days leading up to the gathering, he became an unspoken anchor. He didn't try to fill her silences or erase her anxiety. He simply remained present. He sent her articles he thought she would enjoy, walked with her after difficult meetings, and made small gestures of care that steadied her when her thoughts spiraled. She felt a strange mix of vulnerability and empowerment, Vulnerable because she cared about what he thought. Empowered because he never made her feel foolish for her fears. It was during one of their conversations that the idea first surfaced, timidly, like a thought afraid of being seen. The possibility of him accompanying her. Not as a performance, not as a declaration, but as a quiet act of support. The thought frightened her. She imagined the shock in the room, the whispers, the sharp stares. But she also imagined something she had not let herself consider for years. Walking into a space defined by her past, alongside someone who represented her present. Someone who saw her not through the lens of age or expectation, but through the quiet strength she had rediscovered with him. She didn't ask him to go. But she noticed the way he stayed close when she described the details. How he spoke about the event not with discomfort, but with a calm certainty that she deserved to stand anywhere with dignity. She felt something inside her shift again, an internal recalibration that had nothing to do with him fixing her, and everything to do with him reminding her she no longer had to shrink. The night before the gathering, she stood in front of her mirror longer than usual. She saw the lines time had drawn on her face, the stories etched into her expression, the resilience behind her posture. She also saw, faintly, the woman she once hoped to be, unafraid, luminous, unapologetically herself. And for the first time in years, she felt a pull toward that version of herself. She knew the evening would challenge her. She knew the judgments would be there. But she also knew she wasn't stepping into that room as the woman she used to be. Something had changed. Something had been steadily expanding within her, shaped not by validation but by presence. His presence, yes, but more importantly, her own. The invitation had cut the air when it arrived. Now it cut through something else. The old narrative that told her she did not belong anywhere unless she entered quietly. The days before the gathering unfolded like a series of rehearsals she had not intended to stage. Each morning, she found herself pausing before the mirror longer than usual, studying her reflection with a scrutiny that was both familiar and foreign. She examined the soft lines around her eyes, the contours shaped by time, the steadiness in her expression that life had carved into her. She didn't stand there searching for youth. She searched for courage, for the version of herself who could walk into a room filled with old judgments and remain whole. But courage did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in the way she adjusted her posture, in the way she practiced breathing deeply, in the way she imagined the moment she would see her ex again, the tilt of his head, the assessing glance she knew so well, the silent question between them of who had aged better, who had moved on, who held more power. She knew the dynamics of the past could easily resurface. Old reflexes waited beneath her skin, ready to shrink her back into the version of herself he once shaped. Throughout the days, the young man's presence became an unspoken counterweight to those fears. He didn't know the full extent of her rehearsals, but he sensed the shifts in her mood, the tension that pressed behind her words, the careful pauses, the distracted looks toward nothing in particular. He didn't pry. Instead, he offered the kind of quiet companionship that allowed her to breathe. Passing by her desk, he left a small note with an article recommendation. Later, he sent a message asking if she had eaten lunch, not in a possessive way, just in a human one. She found comfort in the simplicity of his gestures. He didn't try to convince her she had nothing to fear. He understood, without explanation, that fear didn't disappear when someone denied it existed. Fear softened only when someone stayed near without demanding it vanish. He stayed. And in that steadiness, she found room to expand. In the evenings, she practiced what she might wear, not out of vanity, but out of the desire to feel anchored. A dress that balanced elegance and simplicity, shoes that made her feel grounded, a color that reflected not youth, but presence. Each choice felt symbolic, a reclaiming of decisions she had once surrendered. She imagined the gathering again and again, the opening of the restaurant door, the shift in the room's energy when she entered, the glances sent her way before anyone said a word. She anticipated the way her ex would look at her, not with cruelty, but with the subtle condescension he had mastered long ago. She could already sense the tone he would use, the type of comment he might make when enough people surrounded them. calculated, polished, designed to remind everyone of the story where he remained the one who had moved forward gracefully. These scenes played in her mind like old film strips she could not stop replaying. And each time, she practiced something new, holding her chin a little higher, allowing her shoulders to rest instead of tense, reminding herself she had survived far more difficult rooms than this one. She was not the woman she had been when she left that marriage, and she refused to let a single evening convince her otherwise. A part of her wondered if the young man sensed how much she needed reassurance without words, because his presence grew slightly closer as the day approached. Not intrusive, just steady. Their conversations drifted into deeper territories, not about the gathering itself, but about resilience, self-worth, the quiet victories that shape a life. He spoke casually about the ways people can be underestimated, the ways expectations can trap someone into playing a role that no longer fits. She listened, recognizing pieces of her own story in his reflections. One afternoon, as they left the office together, she felt the tension inside her ease unexpectedly. The air was cool, and the sky held the muted colors of early evening. He walked beside her with his usual calm, hands in his pockets, posture open. Something about the moment, its simplicity, its lack of pressure, felt like a reminder that she wasn't navigating everything alone. She didn't need to ask him to be there for her. He already was. The night before the gathering, she stood once more before the mirror. But this time, the rehearsals felt different. She no longer looked for flaws or signs of age. She looked for the woman who had rebuilt her life piece by piece. The woman who had learned to live in silence and then learned to speak again. The woman who had been underestimated but had never truly disappeared. She saw her strength reflected back at her. Strength shaped by pain, but not defined by it. Strength softened by tenderness she was relearning to accept. Strength illuminated by the possibility that someone saw her without diminishing her. For the first time in years, she felt ready. Not to impress anyone, not to prove anything, but to walk into a room as herself. Not the version shaped by her past, but the woman she had quietly become. The evening unfolded with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a moment she had long anticipated, yet never felt prepared for. As she approached the restaurant, the familiar tension settled into her shoulders, the kind that came from stepping into a past that had once defined her. The entrance glowed with warm light, and the muted hum of conversation drifted through the glass door. She paused for a breath, not to steady herself, but to acknowledge the weight of what she was about to face. Beside her, the young man stood with quiet steadiness. He didn't touch her, didn't offer dramatic reassurance. His presence alone grounded her more effectively than any words could. He held himself with the calm composure she had come to depend on, as though he understood that the night was not about proving anything, but about supporting her as she reclaimed a part of herself. His posture was relaxed, confident without arrogance, and when she finally nodded, he matched her pace as they stepped inside. The shift in the room was immediate. Conversations softened, then paused altogether, like a collective inhale. The private dining area was filled with familiar faces, relatives, friends of the family, acquaintances who had witnessed the unraveling of her marriage. She felt their eyes move from her to him, then back to her, registering the difference in age, the unexpected pairing. But before the weight of their judgment could crush her, she drew a quiet breath and walked further into the room. She refused to shrink. Not tonight. Her ex-husband stood near the center of the gathering, surrounded by the subtle admiration he had always known how to attract. His posture was straight, his expression composed, his presence commanding the space with quiet authority. When his eyes landed on her, she saw the familiar flicker, an assessing look that moved from her face to her dress, to the man beside her. It wasn't surprise that crossed his features, but calculation. He had always been skilled at masking emotions beneath layers of civility. The young man beside her didn't falter. He didn't look away, didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't shrink beneath the unspoken questioning directed toward them. He looked at the room with serene confidence, as if he belonged not because of age or expectation, but because he chose to stand beside her. That single detail, his complete absence of discomfort, did more for her than any rehearsed line or prepared speech ever could. She felt every gaze like a touch, noting the subtle reactions: a raised eyebrow, a faint whisper, a polite but startled smile. Some faces showed curiosity, others judgment, others confusion. A few displayed genuine warmth, but none of it mattered as much as she thought it would. Her steps remained steady. The young man's presence was a quiet shield, not by blocking attention, but by reminding her she had changed. She no longer needed permission to occupy space. When they reached the table, she felt the familiar pressure of entering a conversation already in progress. Laughter lingered in the air, though she sensed the tone had shifted. Her ex offered a polite greeting, one dipped in cordiality, but tinged with that subtle condescension she knew too well. He made a small gesture toward the seats, controlling the seating arrangement in that old, practiced way of his, inviting her to sit somewhere slightly peripheral. But the young man gently shifted a chair beside her, not aggressively, simply with the certainty that she deserved to sit wherever she felt comfortable. His quiet insistence altered the dynamic immediately. The old arrangement no longer held power. As plates clinked and servers moved through the room, she felt the tension slowly settling into the corners of her body. The past, the judgments, the familiar choreography of old expectations, they lingered, but they did not dominate her as they once had. She observed the room with new clarity, the way people leaned toward her ex as if waiting for his cues, the way others tried to appear neutral while sneaking glances at her companion, the way some seemed unsure whether to acknowledge what they were seeing. The young man remained composed. He did not attempt to impress anyone or compensate for the age difference with exaggerated politeness. He simply engaged with the environment naturally, his attention shifting between her and the surroundings with ease. His presence brought a groundedness to the space, a quiet reminder that she was no longer tied to the expectations that had once dictated her every move. There was a moment, brief but powerful, when she caught her reflection in one of the glass panels. She saw a woman who had endured, who had rebuilt, who had learned to stand without apology. And beside her stood a man who recognized that strength rather than subtracting from it. The contrast between the two versions of herself, the one who used to walk into rooms like this and the one who stood there now, struck her with a quiet intensity. As the evening continued, the air around them carried an undercurrent of anticipation. She sensed that something significant would unfold before the night ended, though she couldn't name what. The tension was not a threat, but a threshold. She was crossing into a new space within herself, one where she no longer needed to hide her story or diminish her worth. The room had paused when she entered, but she no longer felt the need to absorb its judgment. She had walked into a place defined by the past, but she no longer belonged to that past. The dinner unfolded with the polished elegance expected of family gatherings in expensive restaurants. Pristine table settings, soft lighting, the faint clatter of silverware against porcelain. Yet beneath the refined surface lingered an undercurrent of tension she could feel pressing gently against her ribs. The conversations around the table carried a practiced ease, but the glances directed at her were anything but casual. Each glance seemed to ask silent questions, some curious, some skeptical, some thinly veiled behind polite smiles. She was accustomed to being overlooked in this setting, but tonight she was not invisible. The presence of the young man beside her disrupted the unspoken hierarchy that had once kept her on the margins. He sat with quiet confidence, unbothered by the weight of so many eyes. He didn't attempt to charm or perform. His calm, self-assured demeanor unsettled the assumptions others had of him before he even spoke a word. Her ex-husband occupied his usual place of authority at the table, leaning back in his chair with an air of relaxed superiority. Even in silence, he managed to command attention. He had always known how to hold court without appearing to try. Tonight, however, there was a new tension in the way he observed her, an almost imperceptible tightness around his mouth, a narrowing of his eyes whenever her companion spoke. It was as though he were trying to decipher a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. The dinner's conversation flowed around her like water she could not fully touch. People discussed work promotions, children's achievements, vacation plans. Beneath each topic lay a subtle pattern, Everyone presented themselves as progressing, succeeding, moving in linear, predictable lines. She recognized the tone well, the same tone her ex had once used to remind her indirectly of how she lagged behind in ways that mattered to him. But tonight, she heard the conversations differently. No longer did they dictate her value. The first probing remark arrived wrapped in politeness. A distant relative, smiling too broadly, commented on how unexpected it was to see her with someone new. The phrasing was neutral, but the tone held an unmistakable hint of curiosity dipped in judgment. Before she could form a careful response, the young man simply met the relative's gaze with serene confidence. He didn't need to say anything. His composure answered the question more clearly than words could. The relative blinked, as if startled by the lack of discomfort to exploit, and quickly redirected the conversation elsewhere. Then came the subtle comments from others. Remarks about how time flies, about how everyone is at a different stage of life, about how some relationships surprise us. None of them were overtly malicious, yet each carried a faint sting, wrapped in familiar civility. Her ex remained silent, but his silence felt intentional. He watched the room as though gathering information, assessing every reaction in a way she recognized all too well. When he finally spoke, it was with a practiced lightness. He shared stories from the past, stories in which he shone effortlessly while she appeared as a faint supporting character. He made remarks that seemed humorous on the surface, but contained undercurrents designed to position her as someone who had once needed his guidance. People laughed politely. She remained composed, though she felt the old version of herself stirring, the one who used to shrink, to smile politely, to accept being diminished. The young man beside her noticed the shift before she fully recognized it. His posture changed subtly, leaning just slightly toward her, grounding her without drawing attention. He redirected the conversation with measured grace, offering insights that subtly challenged the narrative without confronting it directly. His ability to navigate the room, calm, intelligent, grounded, caught several people off guard. He didn't match the stereotype they had assigned to him. As the courses continued, she felt the constant hum of evaluation around her. People observed not just her, but the dynamic between her and the young man. Some looked puzzled, others intrigued. A few seemed genuinely warm, offering her glances of quiet encouragement she had not expected. But the majority watched with a mixture of fascination and unease, as though witnessing a disruption in a familiar pattern they relied on to make sense of the world. Her ex's comments grew more pointed, though still wrapped in civility. He mentioned moments from their marriage with strategic timing, highlighting how much he had supported her growth, how he had helped her navigate challenges. The implication was clear. He framed her recent confidence as something rooted in his influence. She recognized the tactic immediately. He was reasserting the old hierarchy, reminding the room of the roles they once played. But the difference tonight was that she no longer stood alone beneath the weight of those narratives. When the young man responded, not with confrontation, but with a quiet clarity that validated her presence, something in the atmosphere shifted. People listened. They noticed. They reconsidered. She felt herself expanding again, reclaiming space within a room that had once constricted her. The judgments were still there, but they no longer defined her. The evening had become more than a dinner. It was a silent reckoning between the woman she used to be and the woman she was becoming. And for the first time, she sensed that the reckoning was not something to fear. It was something long overdue. The moment arrived quietly, the way turning points often do, without announcement, without warning, without any of the dramatic cues people expect from stories. It began with a comment that, on the surface, sounded harmless. A polished remark from her ex-husband, delivered with the same effortless charm he had once used to shape entire rooms. But beneath the smoothness lurked an old, familiar blade, the subtle implication that she was predictable, fragile, impressionable, that whatever new confidence she carried had nothing to do with herself, and everything to do with circumstances she barely understood. The comment was not repeated aloud, but she felt its weight settle over her like a cold hand on her shoulder. The table went momentarily still. A few relatives exchanged quick glances. Someone laughed too softly, uncertain whether the remark was intended as humor or assertion. It didn't matter. She recognized the tone instantly. She had lived under its shadow for years. It was the tone he used to remind her that he still, somehow, believed he knew her better than she knew herself. The old instinct returned with the force of muscle memory. The instinct to shrink, to smooth the tension with a polite smile, to absorb the sting quietly so the room would remain harmonious. Her breath caught, her shoulders tightened, her pulse thinned into something faint. For a brief second, she felt herself slipping back into the woman she had been, pliable, apologetic, shrinking so everyone else could stay comfortable. But before she could fall fully into that silence, another presence rose beside her. Not loudly, not abruptly, but with a calm certainty that cut through the air more sharply than any raised voice could have. The young man straightened slightly, as if aligning himself with the moment. He didn't change expression. He didn't glance around the table. He didn't prepare a speech. His confidence carried no performative edge. It simply existed, rooted and steady. What he said next was not repeated as dialogue. It could not be contained in words alone, not when its power came from the emotion it awakened in her. The room heard his voice, quiet, unwavering, composed, but she felt something deeper, the intention behind it, the message beneath the message. He defended her, not in a protective, possessive way, but in a way that acknowledged her truth, her journey, her strength, her autonomy. His words dismantled, with elegant simplicity, the narrative her ex had relied on for years. He reframed her not as someone shaped by another, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself with resilience and clarity. He spoke of her with a respect that was neither exaggerated nor dramatic. It was honest. It was grounded. It was the kind of recognition she had once believed she would never receive. The room reacted before she did. Conversations stilled completely. Forks hovered mid-air. Faces shifted in quick, startled succession. Surprise, confusion, unwilling admiration. A few lowered their eyes, uncomfortable with the confrontation of truth. Others stared openly, caught off guard by the depth and certainty of a man so much younger offering a perspective none of them had cared to consider. Her ex-husband's reaction was the most striking. His expression did not crumble. He had spent a lifetime perfecting composure, but something tightened near his jaw. Something flickered behind his eyes. An acknowledgement, however fleeting, that he no longer held the authority he once assumed was his by right. He opened his mouth as if to reclaim control, but no words came. His silence, for the first time in years, belonged not to power, but to displacement. She felt the moment wash over her in slow, unfolding layers. First came shock, the disbelief that someone had spoken on her behalf with such clarity. Then came recognition, the understanding that he had not spoken for her, but with her, echoing a truth she had carried quietly for too long. Finally came something she had not expected to feel in that room. Liberation. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was internal, quiet, almost tender. A door inside her opened, releasing a version of herself she had kept hidden behind layers of caution and survival. She felt her spine lengthen, her breath deepen, her gaze steady. She realized she was no longer shrinking. She was no longer apologizing for simply existing. The young man did not look at her after speaking. He didn't need to. His presence beside her remained grounded, unobtrusive, unwavering. He had not acted out of impulse or saviorhood. He had spoken because he saw her clearly, and because, for him, recognizing her dignity was as natural as breathing. The silence that followed was not oppressive. It was transformative. It was the moment the room learned something she had only just begun to accept. She was no longer the woman her ex had shaped. She was no longer a supporting character in her own story. She was someone worth defending, worth acknowledging, worth standing beside. Silence lingered at the table long after his words settled into the air. It wasn't the polite quiet typical of formal gatherings. It was a charged stillness, like the moment after lightning splits the sky. People shifted in their seats, adjusting silverware, clearing their throats, pretending to engage in small talk that could not quite resume its previous rhythm. The entire room felt suspended between the old dynamics and a new reality that none of them had expected. She felt the shift inside her before she noticed the reactions around her. It began subtly, a soft loosening in her chest, a breath that dipped deeper than usual, a lightness that felt foreign after years of moving under emotional weight. For so long, she had been accustomed to managing tension, smoothing conflicts, absorbing comments so they wouldn't escalate. But tonight, she hadn't needed to protect the room from discomfort. Someone else had disrupted the pattern, and she was learning to breathe in the aftermath. Her ex-husband's composure frayed in small but visible ways. His smile tightened at the corners, his posture stiffened. His eyes lost the practiced calmness that had always given him the advantage. He attempted to redirect the conversation, reclaiming the rhythm of the dinner, but his voice lacked its usual effortless authority. His remarks, once polished and subtly dominant, landed flat. A few relatives offered him polite responses, but the energy had changed. The room no longer revolved around him. She noticed this shift not with triumph, but with a quiet sense of clarity. For years, she had believed he possessed a kind of unshakable power over her narrative, power granted to him by habit, by history, by the assumptions of those who had watched their marriage unfold. But now, watching him falter, she realized something profound. The authority he once held had depended entirely on her silence, and she was silent no longer. Across the table, she saw faces registering the change. Some looked uncomfortable, unsure how to reposition themselves within the new dynamic. Others appeared contemplative, as if reconsidering long-held assumptions about her. And a few offered her small, genuine nods, subtle acknowledgments that hinted at respect rather than curiosity. These glimpses of recognition warmed her unexpectedly. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen in a way that did not reduce her. The young man remained composed beside her. He did not bask in the attention his words had drawn. He did not look around the table seeking validation. Instead, he maintained the same steady presence he had offered throughout the evening. Calm, grounded, attentive only to the energy around her. His posture held no bravado, no sense of victory. He had not spoken to win an argument or assert dominance. He had spoken to illuminate the truth of who she was, and that quiet integrity resonated more deeply than any grand gesture could have. In the midst of the lingering tension, she found herself observing the room with new eyes. She noticed the way conversations resumed faintly, how people attempted to fill the silence with neutral topics, weather, work, upcoming holidays. Yet beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The story of the evening no longer belonged to her ex or to the collective assumptions of the group. It belonged to the moment someone chose to see her fully. She allowed herself to sit with the emotion rising quietly within her. Not gratitude, though she felt deeply thankful, or admiration, though she felt that too. What grew inside her was something more intimate: recognition. Recognition of the woman she had become through years of rebuilding. Recognition of her own resilience, her own worth, her own quiet radiance that she had long tucked away for the sake of maintaining peace. As dessert was served, she felt a steadying warmth spread through her. It was not the sweetness on the plate, but the sweetness of reclaiming her narrative. She noticed how effortlessly she held herself now, how her posture no longer curled inward, how her gaze met others without hesitation. The timid rehearsals she had performed in front of her mirror had transformed into something real, embodied. Her ex attempted one final gesture of reassertion, mentioning a detail from their past in a nostalgic tone that implied shared history, shared identity. But this time, the comment slid past her without impact. It no longer touched the part of her that once flinched at such reminders. Instead, she viewed the remark as belonging to another life, another version of herself she had long shed. She glanced at the young man beside her, not seeking reassurance, but acknowledging the role he had played in helping her reclaim something she had once lost, her own voice, even when unspoken. His presence affirmed what she had begun to accept. She did not need to earn respect by shrinking. She did not need to apologize for her choices. She did not need to justify her worth to anyone, least of all to those who had failed to recognize it before. As the evening drew slowly to a close, she realized the night had not been about proving anything. It had been about witnessing herself step into a new chapter with quiet strength. The shock of the moment had passed, but its impact remained, not as a rupture, but as a revelation. She was no longer defined by who she had been with him. She was defined by who she allowed herself to become now. The night ended, but its echoes followed her into the quiet of her apartment, settling softly into the spaces that had once held doubt. She placed her keys on the table with deliberate calm, noticing how her hands no longer trembled the way she had feared they would. The evening had unfolded like a slow unraveling of old narratives, each thread loosening until the story she had carried for years no longer felt like the one she belonged to. She breathed deeply, letting the silence around her expand without pressing against her. She replayed the dinner not as a sequence of events, but as a series of emotional shifts. The shock in the room after his words, the discomfort etched into her ex-husband's expression, the way certain relatives tried and failed to hide their surprise. But what lingered most was the stillness within her, a stillness she had never associated with moments of confrontation. It wasn't triumph or vindication. It was clarity. For years, she had allowed the reactions of others to shape her sense of worth. Rooms like the one she had entered tonight had dictated how high she held her head, how softly she spoke, how much of herself she revealed. But something had changed. Tonight, she had not been measured by those around her. She had been reflected, not by judgment, not by history, but by someone who saw her without distortion. And in that reflection, she recognized herself more clearly than she had in a long time. She moved through her apartment with a new steadiness, turning on the soft lights she preferred, letting their warm glow fill the space. It felt different tonight, not larger, not smaller, but more hers. As she walked into her bedroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror. There, in the dim light, she saw a woman shaped not by the opinions of a single room, but by the resilience forged through years of loss and rebuilding. She saw the strength that had survived heartbreak, the dignity that had weathered silence, the quiet radiance that had begun to return long before she realized it. The young man's presence had not created these qualities. It had illuminated them. He had spoken not to define her, but to acknowledge what was already there. His words had pulled her out of a shadow she had grown accustomed to standing in. And now, even standing alone in her apartment, she could feel the lingering warmth of being truly seen. She sat on the edge of her bed, letting the fabric of the comforter gather beneath her fingers. Her thoughts drifted to her ex, not with bitterness, but with distance. The power he had once held over her felt like a relic, a structure that had collapsed silently the moment she realized she no longer needed to participate in it. His silence at the dinner table, the crack in his posture, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, all of it had revealed a truth she had never allowed herself to accept. He did not define her. He never had. She had simply allowed his voice to be louder than her own. Now, her voice, even when unspoken, felt stronger. It filled her chest with a warmth that reminded her she was still capable of beginning again. Not because someone chose her, but because she finally chose herself. Later that night, she found herself thinking about the young man, not with the frantic uncertainty she once felt, but with a quiet, grounded gratitude. His presence had been steady even after the dinner ended. As they walked together to the car, he didn't ask if she was all right or seek acknowledgement for what he had done. He simply remained beside her, matching her pace, offering silence that felt more supportive than any words could have been. When they parted for the night, he looked at her the same way he always had. Not as someone fragile, not as someone in need of rescue, but as someone worth standing with. That look stayed with her long after the door closed behind him. She lay down, letting the events of the evening settle into memory. The judgments from the room no longer stung. They felt distant, muted, irrelevant, because the truth was simple. The room had not changed her. She had changed herself, slowly, deliberately, through every moment she had chosen to rebuild. Tonight had merely revealed the extent of that transformation. The next morning, the world looked the same. Same sunlight spilling over the floor, same cup of coffee warming her hands, same hum of the city outside. But inside her, something felt different. The tension that had once lived in her shoulders had dissolved. The quiet that filled her home no longer felt like absence, but like space. Space she could inhabit fully, without shrinking. As she prepared for the day, she realized she wasn't replaying the judgments from the dinner. She wasn't imagining what people had whispered or how they had reacted. The only moment that repeated in her mind was the one where she had felt her own strength rising, steady and undeniable. The room no longer mattered. Their expectations no longer mattered. Their narratives no longer defined her. She stepped out of her apartment with a calm that felt earned. Whatever came next, whether her path with the young man deepened or transformed, whether people talked or stayed silent, whether old dynamics attempted to resurface, she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She had reclaimed herself. And for the first time in years, that was enough.